Hi, and welcome to F-World, the Fragility Podcast. Together with our guests from across the globe, we explore how fragility manifests across economics, politics, society, culture, development, and the environment, and how we can build a more resilient future. I'm Mihaela Karste, and I'm joined by my two co-hosts, Paul Biska and Johan Bjurman Bergman. And today we're speaking with Jonathan Marley. Jonathan is a policy analyst in crises and fragility at the OECD. He leads the OECD States of Fragility team and their work. And he also brings a very interesting and rich background to this conversation. He's a former soldier and academic. Welcome to F-World, Jonathan.
Thank you very much for having me.
So we usually like to start at the beginning with all of our guests. We love to learn, how do you end up becoming interested in fragility? What about the way you grew up or what you studied led you to work on what you're working on today?
So I grew up in the west of Ireland. I'm born in 78, so a child of the 80s, which is significant because the conflict in Northern Ireland was still relevant back then. So even though I was not affected by it, it was always on our TV screen. We were always aware of something that was happening there, to the north of the island. I was always inclined towards the outdoors. And so that kind of led me towards the military and choosing the military as a career. And when I joined the military, I didn't fully appreciate how diverse military organizations are until I was fully in there and realized actually it opens up a panoply of careers options to you. And that through deployments to Kosovo and Lebanon, through engagements with people like the Geneva Center for Security Sector Reform, eventually wound its way through a couple of universities and to where I am today at the OECD.
That sounds absolutely wonderful. And I'm actually curious, tell us a little bit about what is it like to be a peacekeeper or soldier, and how does that then influence your desire to address fragility, which is such an abstract concept?
My first deployment was with NATO to Kosovo in 2004, and we deployed just a few days after the March riots that year. So the week before we arrived, 19 people were killed in fighting just prior to our arrival. So my first exposure to peacekeeping or peace enforcing, as that mission was labeled, was being handed my crowd riot control gear at the airport, and essentially spent the first month moving around Kosovo trying to mitigate and head off various clashes and incidents. But it's what happened after that, actually, that really set me on the path to where I am now. That period in the Balkans saw a huge amount of experimentation by military forces because of the context they found themselves, because of the post-conflict context that they found themselves in. So within weeks of putting away our crowd riot control gear, I was delivering Irish aid projects in our area of operations. And even though at the time we called them humanitarian, in fact, they were development. We were building schools, we were building houses, we were speaking to local councils trying to figure out what their financial projections were. We were looking at health centers. So very quickly, it went way beyond what up to that point had been called hearts and minds type work that militaries would have done because the opportunity allowed it and maybe it was a nice thing to do. The other thing that happened at that time was you saw the consolidation of ideas around civil-military cooperation. And so you saw some of that activity being brought into military planning processes and becoming categorized as another way of achieving your objective. And that really evolved from the Balkans through Iraq into Afghanistan, into certainly a lot of what we saw around stabilization interventions and so on. But so much of the experimentation that went into that lies behind things like the provincial reconstruction teams that we saw in Afghanistan. Actually, a lot of the origins of that was in the Balkans, and a lot of the experimentation that was going on in the Balkans at that time. There is no way I would be allowed to do, or someone in uniform would do an Irish aid project like that now. But at that time, people were trying to adapt and respond to what they were seeing in front of them. And that got me thinking about that initially about that relationship between military and civilian actors in a post-conflict setting. And over time, that evolved into looking at issues like fragility. It evolved then looking, particularly in my case, looking at issues around security sector reform. And that gradually led me more and more to development conversations where I saw a gap between what military planning and strategies were and what development planning and strategies were, and how they impacted on each other in different contexts.
So, Jonathan, you just described for us the fact that as a peacekeeper in the Balkans, you did a lot of development and humanitarian work. But tell us a bit more about the peacekeeping part. How is that like? You got up in the morning, you went on patrol, and then what happens next?
No 2 days were the same. The initial focus was very much on dealing with the aftermath of those riots and trying to ease tensions between communities within the area that we were operating in. So we put a lot of emphasis on building community relations. This was just before the liaison and observation team concept really took hold in Kosovo. But we would assign our troops to different villages. We encouraged them to meet the locals, meet not just the local leaders, but stop people in the street and chat to them. And it was all about building up relations, building up networks around simple issues. And I think that's where a lot of the drive came for the kinds of projects that we started to build in around schools and so on. They became very much part of that conversation, and they allowed us to shift the emphasis away from some of the more sensitive issues around that maybe divided communities to areas that maybe you could build consensus around. So I've seen it happen in a lot of other places elsewhere, but what we were trying to do was to adapt our way of working day to day so that we would go to villages, find out what was going on, build the relationships, take that information back to see how we can manage the resources we have to allow tensions to reduce. And it worked. It worked because you could, if something happened, if you heard something happened in one part of your area and you knew it was likely to reverberate on another, you could get on the phone. You could say something has happened. We're checking this out. Please stay where you are, and we'll get back to you with more solid information when we have it. And that sounds like quite an innocuous call, but so often that just bought you the time and space you needed to figure things out, maybe to put in position troops so that things couldn't escalate. So a lot of it was about prevention, about preemption, about gathering as much information, and I say information as opposed to intelligence, to respond to the dynamics that were within your area. And so much of our time was spent building those kinds of relationships and doing those kinds of tasks. And what I learned later in my career when I was aide de camp to the UN head of mission in Lebanon was actually how much the same dynamics played out, that it was the personal relationships you build, even at very high levels, that often allowed for potentially serious incidents to be mitigated before they got out of hand.
And you've just mentioned that today no Irish soldier would deliver Irish aid in the way you did it during your deployment in Kosovo, which reflects a bit the fact that these lines of work, humanitarian, development, and security, have become more structured, whereas in your time they were more entrepreneurial. Is that a good thing or a bad thing, this change?
I really enjoyed doing the work that we did in Kosovo, and it was entrepreneurial. Maybe we were not the most entrepreneurial group that were there. I know the Finnish were so advanced. They had relations with the local university. They were trying to embed research projects around what they were doing. They had a bigger budget, which also helped. And what was interesting about that time was almost every contingent there, and it wasn't just NATO contingents. Ireland is not a member of NATO. So there were a lot of other non-NATO countries there as well. Almost all of them had a different approach to how how to engage in these kinds of issues. So we were all looking at each other's notebooks in that sense to see what was working, what was having traction. By the time I went back to Kosovo in 2007 for my second tour, you could see the structures beginning to take hold. You could see, as I said at the start, how some concepts were being formalized within military planning processes, and how I think that led to some unfortunate practices, maybe not necessarily in Kosovo, but in other contexts that didn't help. I think also the military, certainly Western militaries, invest a huge amount in education, and our awareness of the boundaries between military and humanitarian actors, between military and development actors, evolved significantly during that period as well. So, and I think particularly between military and humanitarian, where our sense of what was important to them was continuously reinforced through our training. And I think that allowed for better relationships to emerge at local level, certainly. That didn't happen to the same extent on the development side. And I think it's still a gap that remains to be addressed. Military and development actors don't typically talk to each other. I appreciate the dynamics are different and maybe conversations need to happen at a higher level, but they're not really happening at the higher level. And when you see that entrepreneurial spirit that a lot of militaries have, and you see how that went unchecked through a 20-year period and through different deployments, you can see the implications of that lack of dialogue and how they can affect not just an individual organization's or sector's effectiveness, but the entire effectiveness of the overall strategy.
So you've alluded to in your description of Kosovo and of Lebanon to the importance of interpersonal relations at every level. And we know that, of course, for those to work and in general for societies, in fragility, we find challenges with trust. So I wanted to understand a bit more, how did you go about building that trust interpersonally as a soldier, as a peacekeeper in such volatile environments? And perhaps how has that influenced your work today and how you think about the concept of trust in the conceptualization of the States of Fragility reports and your work at the OECD?
In Kosovo, we were very conscious of the posture and the image we presented to the local population. So where the situation allowed, and certainly as things calmed down, you would sling your rifle behind your back. You would wear a beret instead of your helmet. And these are very small gestures, but they are to a community that has just come through conflict. They notice these things quite quickly. And then it is about looking at the areas where you can essentially build relationships. And so it's a lot of time going, drinking coffee and just simply listening and finding out to what's going on. The difficulty we always have, and it certainly wasn't unique to us, was the high rotations of military cycles through these areas. We were on a 6 to 8 month cycle, depending on the circumstances. So by the time, again, I went back in 2007, you were very aware of a certain fatigue with the local community because it was yet another rotation, yet another new set of faces. And if you didn't manage that process carefully, they were being asked the same questions that they've been asked 10 times before, and you could easily lose the trust that you might have established at an early stage. So it often evolved around local issues that simply made the lives of people in your area easier. In 2004, we spent a lot of time looking at opening up local markets, managing the security around those markets, so both communities were comfortable going to them and using them. We spent a lot of time talking to education authorities about how schools, who typically they ran staggered schedules, so different ethnic groups would go at different times. So you were trying to manage elements of that because there was different communities moving to and from, and so much of it was about just maintaining a presence to keep the peace, and speaking to people about what the best way to do that was. And we didn't always get it right. There was a lot of ad hocism in that, I think, because it was such an unusual environment at that time. A lot of our experience had come from Lebanon, which was a static peacekeeping mission. Irish troops have been there since 1978. That there is a deep corporate cultural knowledge there to fall back on. We didn't have that in Kosovo, certainly in the early days, and we didn't have it in some of the other missions that we went on to take after that. But the fundamentals were always about the same. You couldn't stay in the barracks. You had to get out. You were conscious of your posture. You engaged on the issues that mattered to the local community. And then the other side of that was being realistic about what you could do about their situation, and being honest that a lot of the times the things that we're asking for were simply not possible for us to deliver on. And so there was that finding that balance. And that replicated itself, not just in Kosovo, it replicated itself certainly in Lebanon after 2006. And we've seen it in almost all conflict situations since then.
Johan, unless you have a follow-up, I'd like to ask a question. So hearing you talk, and sort of, you already said that what you were able to do as a soldier in terms of sort of some of the development programs you would not be able to do today, it made me wonder, what's the difference between peacekeeping and peace building? Actually, not peacekeeping is more clear, but peace building and development ultimately, because the kind of activities you're describing are helping those elements of society, economy, governance that are essential for development in a way. And I know it's a bit of a provocative question, but I really want to sort of maybe clarify, even just for myself, but also for the audience. What's that difference? Because it's sometimes hard to see.
It is hard to see, and I won't be able to give you an easy answer to that. For peace building, for me, that was always about a much more locally political process, looking at communities, looking at relationships, and trying to figure out ways for maybe allowing coexistence, maybe looking then towards better sharing of space. It can unfold in different ways, but always with that idea of getting to some kind of idea of positive peace for a particular area. Whereas I think that, and so it's bounded in that kind of political context for me that you find, depending whether it's a local community or whether it's on a national scale. So it is about people and relationships, and how to get those relationships to work coherently with each other. Whereas for me, development, and I knew nothing about development at this point in time, and arguably still I'm on a steep learning curve over the last couple of years. But it's much broader, it's more technical, and you can see where the emphasis maybe with development is more on the resilience that sits around a peace than necessarily on the peace itself. And so that can present in a lot of different ways. You can see it in the justice system, you can see it in the alleviation of poverty, you can see it in the maybe anti-discrimination work. You can that maybe not directly relevant to a particular peace building concept, but they all feed into it. And I think that's where for me, it is the connections that exist between these two spaces that are perhaps much more pronounced and extensive than is often given credit for. And so that's really my primary interest now, is exploring those connections and when you find those connections, what they mean for each side of or for each type of approach. So that's the distinction I make when I approach this work. I also find that peace building tends to be more often more intuitive and certainly more political, whereas development approaches tend to be more technical and process driven. And there are things to be learned on both sides for the effectiveness of both of those approaches. I've found that on a lot of occasions with peace building processes, the evidence to inform a peace conversation exists on the development side, whereas on development sides, the political capital for sustaining the kinds of reforms and institutions that you're trying to build exists in the peace building space, and connecting the two is often difficult, but arguably the kind of is the necessary blend that you need to start delivering more effective outcomes.
So how do you make that connection effective? In one of your OECD papers, you talk about this missing middle between the kind of local peace building processes that you've described, and then the broader national development strategies or policies. Can you tell us more about that? What are your views?
Yeah, I bring a particular military perspective to this part of the conversation. One of the things that strikes me as one of the most pronounced differences I see between the world I came from in the military space and where I am now is the emphasis on planning. So the military typically plan at three levels. They plan at a strategic policy level, they plan at an operational level, and they plan at a tactical level. There is no operational level really when it comes to development planning. And that speaks to a lot of the literature I've read on this idea around a missing middle. And it's curious that is not resourced. And then you see it play out in different ways. But I think if you look at the conversations around, say, localization and localized peace building, often what you see is really exceptional work, really innovative, impactful work that struggles to maintain an impact over a sustained period of time because the architecture and frameworks are not there to allow the success to hold. A lot of military planners look at this distinction between tactical actions and operational and strategic effect, and so they resource that area. They're constantly looking to see how can you capitalize on the effect that you achieve at a local level and ensure that reverberates up through different levels of a particular area. And it's curious to me that there is not more attention emphasized on that in development cycles. I've noticed that people talk about fragmentation in the development space, and you can see this disconnect between very localized approaches, which are community driven, and then these national processes, which may be completely technically driven, with an obvious relationship from a stand away point, but actually no connection practically between them in a given context. And I think that is, I saw that play out, for example, in Gambia, where you had a security sector reform process running essentially in parallel to a national development plan that it was supposed to be part of. And actually, the localized component, which was also relevant there, was a truth and reconciliation process, which was immensely powerful and very, very admirable, and arguably could have lent more momentum to processes elsewhere across the system. So you can see how there was a lot to admire in what the Gambians were doing, I think. But there was these little gaps that maybe limited some of the realization of the potential that was there.
So just a very, very quick follow-up, and I know Paul has one too. Can you hypothesize about why there's such lack of attention? What are the incentives within the structure of those that do development, those entities that focus on these issues, whether at the local level or at the national level? What's missing? What incentives could we bring to the table? Because the way you described it from the military, and I remember also reading the examples you gave with the NATO admissions in Afghanistan and Bosnia, and how the UN peacekeeping missions, for example, report directly to headquarters without actually going through that middle, operational middle. It's also, if you're thinking about private sector, corporations, when you organize a giant project, let's say you're building a nuclear power plant, you have to have that operational middle, otherwise your project is going to fail. So what is missing in the, if you can hypothesize, or if you know or have a strong opinion about it, what's missing in the development space? And Paul?
I actually wanted to build on that and offer a possible counterpoint to what you just said, Jonathan, because a lot of development projects in fragile states that I'm at least familiar with, and the people working on them, will say, hang on, actually, there's a lot of operational planning going on. We have these massive project appraisal documents that are developed together with the government. We do a host of consultation efforts with local communities. We go on mission to supervise project implementation multiple times a year. We get reports that could be even geolocated. We have people in the field trying to work closely with communities. So how would you respond to that argument?
I have to be honest and say that I'm coming from a pretty constricted evidence base or experience level when it comes to these issues. So I can only speak to the experience that I have. What I've seen is, first of all, that there is a difference in scale of resources that I've seen in the application of the military style of planning and delivery versus development. And development they don't have access to the same scale of resources that military planners typically have in these kinds of contexts. And that's, so you find development, I've found the teams that I've observed have been quite small, doing immense work, but actually don't have the same number of levers to pull that somebody in a military mission might have. They also don't have the analytical capacity behind them that the military have. I mean, if you look at NATO, they have entire headquarters just doing this analysis all the time, in peace and in war. There's nothing comparable to that on the development side. The other standout point I've seen is the development space is much more fragmented. There's so many more actors. There are different ideologies at play, different interests at stake. Militaries have the advantage of, generally when they deploy, they have a more coherent and simple structure to follow. So they have that advantage, and that shouldn't be discounted. I think there's a lot in that kind of, you have to plan for a particular level and the level that you're operating at. And that includes supporting the operational connections between the local effects that you want to have and the more national strategic effects that you want to have. I think the other element that is striking for me is the challenges associated with working with the local people in your area, whether that's a community or whether that's a national government, and the balance between delivering an effect from the point of view of your program construct and actually meeting the priorities that they set for themselves. And I think that is, I think people, I've been really impressed with a lot of the literature that has come out on this, people like Susanna Campbell and that who've been looking at questions around accountability and trust and the willingness to allow the local leaders wherever you are, the local communities wherever you are, to take the reins and drive forward themselves. I think that is not typically a challenge that militaries have, but it is a really big part of the development challenge. So it is more complicated in that sense. So there are aspects of this that the development community, I think, just simply have more to deal with when it comes to the types of work that they're doing. But I think they would definitely be aided with looking at the kind of analytical, the investment in analysis and evidence and data and indeed intelligence, Paul, that goes into military decision-making processes. And I think there's something to be learned from that model that could benefit development. What I don't know is how you can capture that for a community that is so diverse and so fragmented. And I don't mean fragmented in a negative way. I just mean the reality of so many different actors and so many different agencies. I don't know how you consolidate and capture that kind of analytical potential in a way that allows a substantial part of that community to move forward to greater effectiveness. And I think that's part of what we're trying to address with the OECD, is that we're trying to provide that shared analysis that people can coalesce around, and therefore build more consensus in their approaches.
So one of the aspects that you've alluded to now, and a little bit with talking about the continuous analysis of NATO, and also in one of the background papers to the State of Fragility report, is of course the business case for prevention. And we know how incredibly effective $1 spent on prevention has something like, correct me if I'm wrong, $8 or $10 effect on in saved costs of war, etc. But you also mentioned how the current funding patterns are at odds with this very strong business case. So I would love to hear a bit more from you, kind of how are they at odds, more in detail, and how do you see them shifting? How do we create incentives to focus more on prevention when it's so hard to quantify and estimate the crises that never happen? And so would love to hear your thoughts on that aspect.
This has been one of the most interesting areas I've encountered since I switched to the OECD. What I've noticed is, and you're right to say, the volumes of funding that are going to prevention are comparatively much more to what you see going to other to humanitarian, to development practices and so on. It's a noticeably small piece of the pie when you consider the emphasis that has been placed on it, certainly since the Pathways report of 2017. What I've observed is that there is still a lot of uncertainty about what good prevention looks like. I think I've noticed that people have struggled to strike the balance between what is conflict prevention, what is preventing crisis. We've got, I think, some really excellent work in the disaster risk response space, which I think has informed some of this conversation. And then what is development? And then, so how do you strike a balance between all of those areas in a fragile and conflict affected context to deliver the effect? How do you disentangle all of that? And I think people are still struggling quite a lot with that. And it's not an easy one to disentangle. We have looked, my colleague Harsh Desai has researched this extensively, and we're still continuing to work on this. We are looking at what are the helpful distinctions that could be made here to allow people working in capitals, people working in fragile contexts directly, the institutions of these contexts. What are the distinctions that we could make to allow them to better organize themselves for this, to be more effective when it comes to prevention? I suspect, given the weight of evidence that is now coming forward, given the fact that our appreciation and our understanding of how fragility presents itself is evolving and improving all the time, I think there will be a push to maybe breaking down ideas around prevention into components that work for policies and programs in fragile contexts. So it may be that the way out of this, the way to respond to this challenge is to break it into parts that we can manage more easily. And so I can see, for example, there's already quite a well-developed literature and well-developed policy consensus around what good conflict prevention can look like. I think it's when you step back from, particularly in instances where there is an immediate threat or presence of conflict. When you step back from that immediate threat, the concept starts to lose traction insofar as how you can translate a concept into practice. And I think that's where ideas around crisis prevention, and I know this was touched upon in Pathways and several other reports since then, the work of CIC NYU, where you shift maybe the emphasis to crisis, and that allows for a different conversation to take place, and maybe it allows maybe to depoliticize some of the components that go into a conflict prevention conversation. And then I think this is where I think the advent of DRR has been so helpful, the disaster risk response approaches, because they allow, again, to shift the emphasis into a space where you can concentrate on a certain set of propositions, but whilst being mindful of a broader dynamic. So I would hope that there's some potential in that. I think the other thing we see, the other part of this, and that as you kind of pull back from the immediate threat of conflict, is then the questions of, well, how do you build coping capacities and resilience to respond to risks that are identified? And I think that is, for me, I think what I've seen over the last 2 years is that there is a shift in emphasis more clearly now onto being smarter about how to support those coping capacities and how to build that resilience. And I think that's hopefully where we'll see a lot of the better progress in the years to come.
I also have a thought on this, and I'm always wondering, when it comes to prevention of anything, just like in our day-to-day lives, we know we're supposed to eat healthy and exercise and not have the brownie. But usually we start taking action when something scares us enough to actually do something about it. So sort of the crisis comes, and then we invest in ourselves, or let's say in fixing a disaster. I'm half joking, but I'm also wondering the role that human psychology plays in this, and whether that's something we can even do anything about, no matter how good our systems are. But that was just a comment. I actually want to take us to a key question that we always want to ask our guests. And that is, what is fragility to you? How do you define it?
So my first exposure to the concept of fragility was when I was working in the Irish Defence Forces Military College. So my job there was to design third level programs for military officers, essentially a kind of a military MBA type program. And part of the thing we were looking at was how we could improve our approach to that operational level in planning. Now, already in that planning design, you have the space for multidimensional analysis. So you do look at political indicators, you're looking at economic trends. So that is already allowed for in the military planning. But it struck me that it was often we didn't have the depth of expertise to really do it to the scale that you would like it done, or we didn't have the network to tap into to get access to that expertise and information to round out what we would hope to be a good operational level plan. And that's how I came to the concept of fragility and the idea of fragility as an analytical lens and bringing that in. So that's where I initially encountered the States of Fragility work of the OECD. And so I brought that I integrated that into some of our training modules for operational level planning, and it worked really well, because immediately it gave a breadth and depth of analysis that we weren't getting access to. And so we found that when the staff were getting to decision points about how to where they wanted to be at certain points in the planning cycle, their decisions were much better informed and much more aware, not just of what their immediate military objective was, but what was the impact on society likely to be? What was the impact on the economy like to be if you're going to use up 60% of the port capacity to get military equipment into a particular area? What is the impact going to be environmentally if you're going to if you were going to conduct operations in a certain way? Suddenly you found that they were producing much more rounded solutions to the scenarios that we were presenting. So that's where my interest was sparked. And I arrived at the OECD at a really good time, because the conversation around fragility and the definition and understanding of fragility had evolved through the introduction of the multidimensional fragility framework in 2015, 2016, And then with this definition that sought to move away from the focus on states to this idea of a balance between exposure to risk and coping capacities to mitigate and deal with that risk, both at a kind of community level up to a national level. So that was immediately attracted to me with my military planning hat on, because it made so much sense that you would look at situations in this way and maintain that perspective to provide a certain level of analysis. And I still think that that definition strikes the right balance. I think where we have work to do is in communicating the coping capacity, the resilience side of that definition of fragility, alongside the risk that people tend to focus on. So hopefully that is something we can do with our forthcoming report next September. But I think there is I appreciate there are a lot of criticisms and critique that we really try hard to engage with around fragility and how as a concept and how it's used. But what we've seen over the last year as we've gone through a review process of our multidimensional framework is the variety of ways that the framework is used by different donors, by fragile contexts themselves, more and more. So we're seeing that people appreciate that kind of analysis and that it has a value at a particular level, mindful that that value only goes so far. It won't give you a local an understanding of a local situation sufficient to come up with a localized response, but it will help to maintain a perspective to ensure that whatever response you come up to at a local level is balanced with the need, with a broader set of needs. And I think we've seen some good examples of how that can be applied. So I'm convinced of the value as an analytical tool. I've been impressed with the community that I've stepped into and their willingness to test and evolve the concept and their openness to critique and conversation. And I think that's a really healthy sign as we look ahead, that there is space around the concept to evolve it even further and to refine it and to make it more useful for the people who apply it to their policies and programs.
So I wanted to go into that because obviously you have such rich operational background, and that's a key differentiator, I think, for you compared to a lot of other people who are in this space. So I imagine that you also think a lot about how the work that you and your team at the OECD does gets translated through levels of bureaucracy and actually gets implemented in the field and benefits people who experience fragility in their day-to-day. So as you and your team think about the operationalization of your work and of your insights, what are some of the key aspects for you, and what are some of the key value adds you think that the OECD and the States of Fragility reports can have in terms of bringing new and more innovative and perhaps, as you say, more locally responsive ways for operations in fragile states?
We've seen it play out in a number of different ways. For a lot of our primary focus is on serving the International Network on Conflict and Fragility at the OECD, the members there. So we try and support them as much as we can with the work that we do. And their needs are very different. They have, some of the smaller members don't have the analytical capacity to generate the kinds of research that they need to inform their policies at scale. So we can meet a need there. For some of the bigger members, we often find that we have quite intensive exchanges around the methodologies that we use. Comparing notes and findings is a really big part of what we do. I mean, simply comparing the research analysis and outcomes to see if we're on the same page or what the differences are, and often those conversations can be really beneficial. For our conversations we with fragile context directly, and I must acknowledge the G7 Plus here, it is often I find some of the conversations around particular dimensions within our fragility framework come to the fore in those cases where, for example, in the environmental dimension or the security dimension, where they're looking at particular issues that they see from reading our reports and documentation, and they're kind of saying, well, what does a response, what does a good response look like here? And those are very, very rewarding exchanges as well. I think that we have, to be honest, though, about where at the level that the OECD's fragility framework sits at, I think it has a very clear strategic value. If you want to do entry point analysis for conflict prevention, it's a really good framework to use. If you want to get a sense about whether you have attained a good balance of emphasis in your policy or program across different dimensions of fragility, it's a really good way to test that. And indeed, a lot of our members do use it that way. It's also a useful tool insofar as in any context you will have humanitarian development and peace actors, including all of the local actors operating in a space. It is also useful in getting a sense of what the best division of labor might be on a particular, to respond to a particular situation. Who should you be talking to based on the issues that you see from the multidimensional analysis? So what's happening in the economic space? Who do you need to talk to there? What's happening in the political space, and who do we need to talk to there? So I think it provides the evidence base for a healthier dynamic across the triple nexus to allow the more focused conversations to happen. And again, we've seen good examples of that. And I hope with our work on the peace and development side that we can lean more into that side of the conversation and hopefully have more traction. So we have seen throughout our analysis over the last 18 months, we've seen the framework applied in a lot of different ways. And we also have a sense of where the potential is to go further with it. We've spent a lot of time looking at our environmental dimension, which I think will be much more geared towards looking at ecological issues and looking at not just climate change, but environmental degradation. I think we're positioning ourselves to be offer more value in that space. And similarly, across some of the other dimensions, we've had really excellent exchanges with academics and with other policy leaders about how to fine tune the indicators that we have to provide better analysis. So it's been a fantastic learning journey to go through people's experience of applying the tool that is the fragility framework in different ways, and there is so much more potential to be explored with it yet, and I think that's what's exciting about it.
So speaking of that, I wanted to ask you, do you find it useful to think of fragility as a kind of continuum between, let's say, one stage of elevated risks, which the OECD framework clearly identifies, then moving on to a stage of active conflict, followed by usually a protracted period of post-conflict reconstruction, and then situations where a country may be on the verge of becoming fragile, but is really affected by external spillovers. So with a huge influx of refugees or spillovers from violence and armed groups. I'm asking because development banks have now started applying these kinds of differentiated frameworks. And the kind of critique that you sometimes get is, well, first, how do I know which stage I'm at? Because there's a lot of back and forth. So none of these stages are static, and some are more obvious than others, like when you have an insurgency going on. But then in situations when there are risks arising, like how do I really know that this is actually fragility is going to bubble up into conflict? Or if you have external spillovers, how can you adequately assess or predict that they're going to really hit your society and your economy? What do you think about that?
The phrase we used to get in the military was that you should be comfortable in ambiguity. And at the time, we used to elicit a series of eye rolls, but I think it probably applies even more when it comes to consideration of fragility. We have... It's interesting to see how the concept is presented. So you have people talk about escaping fragility. If you hear fragility traps, I think this. We do our very best to keep up to speed with the literature that comes out on fragility to see where people's perspectives are. I think our experience of the pandemic, though, I think maybe has pushed forward our appreciation, certainly within our little team, about what our understanding of fragility might be. In that we have seen how interconnected risks are. We've seen the importance of systems. We have seen how risk can cascade through systems, and often the pathways that risk travels and that you have the knock-on effects are maybe not immediately obvious from an initial analysis. So from that first instance of an outbreak in Wuhan through if you were to say to somebody back then, how is this going to travel? Nobody would have been thinking about global supply chains, and people would not have been thinking about food prices in West Africa, and people would not have been thinking about how this was going to affect fishing and how it was going to affect violence. And so, but what we saw was an explosion of cascading effects through systems and through networks that each elicited and required their own responses. And I think that's where the coping capacity side of the definition comes into play. And so we equally saw how some coping capacities rose to the challenge. We saw social safety nets emerging. We saw countries adapting, often in the absence of any kind of international support, adapting with what they had to face the challenges that were brought forth, or indeed maybe some local risks that were already there, but that were amplified by the impact of the pandemic. So that reassured us as to our definition. But I think it also pushed us towards thinking about this idea of the universality of fragility, that everybody is exposed to fragility, regardless of where you live, regardless of how your state might be categorized. Everybody is exposed to fragility to some degree. And what we saw, in fact, was that interplay of risk and coping capacities play out globally. And some places were able to manage that better than others. And what can we learn about that? So I think the idea of continuums and almost trying to structure it in a sequenced way was exposed by that experience very clearly. And so what you find is this, and I think this is where ideas around adaptation and some of the, well, certainly I've seen that in the peace space, but I think some of the ideas you see around more dynamic adaptation and around some of the emerging ideas around building resilience, I think that's where you get that sense of, well, we live in this kind of a system. We've seen how these risks, we've been given a really good example about how risk can travel through networks and systems, and how coping capacities have responded. So how can we learn from that to come up with a response that is agile enough at local and national levels to respond to that? But there is no beginning and there is no end. And I think that's the point. That's one of the points we took away, that there is this constant dynamic that you engage with and you respond to and you adapt, and what worked 12 months ago might not work in 12 months time, and you do the best with the evidence and analysis you have to try and build in decisions into that process. So that is the best answer I can come up with you to that question at the moment. But it is a question that we'll continually try to answer, but it's more, not so much of an answer, maybe more of where we are right now and our thinking about what we've learned from the experience of the pandemic and how that applies to what we're seeing elsewhere.
I actually think it's a fantastic answer because it triggered about 10 simultaneous questions and thoughts, and I'm going to try to order them in some way. So let me just start with adaptation. The word adaptation immediately made me think that there are other areas, such as climate change adaptation, where we can take a highly multidimensional risk with various degrees of uncertainty and localize its adaptation planning. So I'd love to, at some point, maybe if we get to it, hear your thoughts about what can we learn from other domains. But then that also made me think of systems thinking and how much it's lacking and how much we need human capital that has more of a practice in understanding systems, in understanding networks, how things propagate through a network, and what are unintended effects. Which one example, because we are talking pretty abstractly, and that makes me excited, might make you excited, but some people need real examples. So you mentioned the pandemic, and another example would be Ukraine. What's going on right now? Not necessarily with the war, but what does Ukraine have to do with the price of the cup of coffee that we're all enjoying this morning? Well, guess what? Russia is the largest exporter of various fertilizer products, and that is needed in Brazil, which is the largest exporter of coffee, I think, sugar, and soybeans, which all depend on the price of fertilizer, which, as we know from Econ 101, when you take supply off the market, demand stays stable, price will increase. So that is, for example, a second and third order effect where the average person might go to the store and not understand why their price for coffee has just hopefully not doubled, because that would be very sad for me personally. So this is, and I saw in the States of Fragility 2020, and I was very excited by it, that you mentioned we need a systems approach in thinking about them, but also in planning an adaptive dynamic response. My question to that is, while I fully support that notion, programmatically in how we dish out money, both in development and in any sort of, even in the humanitarian space, you have to have a mandate, you have to have donors have their own interests and desires and funding cycles and budget restrictions. And for anybody that's managed a grant, you know how many, the bureaucracy in place, which is there for good reason, because you do not want to mismanage donors' money. But if you're trying to respond to a system that's dynamic and adaptive, because unfortunately, that's what we're talking about in the real world, how do we respond with static tools?
Part of this comes back, I think, to the points I was making early on about the value of the operational level of planning. And this, I think, is an example of an issue that, if we could resource this so that the people designing the programs don't have to do it, but have the benefit of the analysis and the evidence coming from that analysis, then I think it would make for better decision makings. And I think that's where the potential lies. It's interesting, only yesterday the OECD published its economic outlook on Ukraine. It was a short piece looking at the immediate impact, and it touches indeed on those points you make about rising food prices, rising energy costs. What that, from the point of view of the work that we do with the States of Fragility, where we know that these risks are compounded in fragile contexts, where we know that the people often most exposed to the reverberating impact of those issues, as they travel through systems, live in fragile contexts. I think that's where we need to maintain a perspective on what a globalized response looks to this. Maybe globalized is not the best word to use in this instance, but my point is that the more expensive price of a cup of coffee in Washington or New York is a whole different proposition when you look at the impact of increased food prices and economic and energy costs for a certain fragile context. And then you look at the multidimension, you bring your fragility analysis to that, and you say, well, actually, what are the reverberations across other dimensions? What does this mean societally, where people have to make prioritization about how much food they can afford to buy? And what does that mean politically about what pressures do they put on their local political leaders? And so that's where I think the value of multidimensional analysis comes into play, because we can start to think about what the implications might be and then adjust accordingly. We have touched on we definitely see the potential in this, the value of bringing more systems thinking into this space, and we touched on that in the last report. We've spoken to a number of people within the OECD and indeed beyond about how this might be done. I mean, it's such a broad and intense area of literature on its own, but what we would like to see are ways of actually bringing that analysis to bear for the benefit of fragile contexts. And what that comes down to is really getting them, whoever they might be in a fragile context, the evidence that they need to make the decisions that they, give them the best possible chance to make the best decisions. And I think that that's where we've seen the potential in systems thinking, because it can, again, identify those connections across in a particular context that might not be immediately obvious to an initial analysis, or indeed where local actors are forced to deal with immediate issues and they maybe don't have time to think about the medium to long-term consequences. There's also a particular value there. So again, not a very neat answer to your question, I'm afraid, but that's where we definitely we see the potential of integrating that approach. And again, I hope that's, as I say, it ties back into that point about, can we resource a level of planning above maybe the programmatic level that would help and make their life easier to deal with all the other points that you identified.
So we've briefly mentioned Ukraine, and of course, until now in our conversation, we've discussed a lot the relationship between security and development. But as we are all watching the terrible events unfolding now with the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there's also, of course, the diplomatic angle to this, and it's a topic, the relationship between security, development, and the humanitarian side, and of course, diplomacy. There are all aspects that you have written about. So I wanted to ask you two questions. The first is, you've helped us a bit identify blind spots that the security and the development world have vis-a-vis one another. Could you do a bit the same, but for the development side and the diplomatic world? So what do you believe are some critical elements, advantages that you believe all development professionals should know about diplomacy, especially in bringing that kind of a missing middle, the operational side, the link between local peace-building processes that diplomats can be quite embedded into, making the link between those processes, then, of course, and then the development efforts. And then my second question, again, going back to your work on the role of diplomacy along the humanitarian development peace nexus, we have a situation right now in Ukraine where diplomacy, at least on one side, the Russian side, is actually working to make the country more fragile, more conflict prone. So then what would need to get done to make sure that diplomacy is actually helping rather than hindering at this point in the conflict?
I think I'll take the last point first on Ukraine. I think it's way too early to say with any degree of certainty how that conflict is going to unfold. I don't think a particular trend has established itself yet that allows us to start thinking about what the diplomatic response will need to be and what kind of frameworks and structures will need to fall into place around that for some kind of solution to emerge. There's just too much uncertainty in that space for me right now. What we have seen and what we tried to draw out with that paper was, first of all, diplomats are uniquely positioned to work across the triple nexus. So they have, by virtue of their position, they can speak to and engage with actors across humanitarian development and peace pillars in a way that it's very difficult for people within those pillars to do for themselves. So they have that perspective, a strategic perspective that they can bring to that relationship. That also comes, I think, with their convening power. And we've seen demonstrations of this. I think there's really good example, for example, led by Sweden in Congo, where they were able to play that convening power to bring actors from different parts of the nexus together around a particular set of issues. So there are good examples already out there of how this can work and how diplomats can play different roles, often in very ad hoc ways, responding to the situation that they find themselves in, but capitalizing on their ability to move across pillars and to convene and to bring political heft maybe to certain conversations. And so that perspective and convening power is really your starting point. Thereafter, I think it is the quality of the evidence and data that they have to work with that counts. So where, for example, if you're looking at, let's stick with conflict and post-conflict situations, where you're looking at the development value or the value, of development thinking for a peace process, diplomats are very well positioned to capture that. They typically have they have the access, but can we give them the evidence that they need to make the right decisions within a particular arena? And so this matters because you will see, for example, how important maritime policy is maybe for, the overlap, say, for example, between maritime policy and maritime security and how that plays out, which could be a component, could be an important component of the peace mission. We can see it in the extractive sector with the management and governance of natural resources. So when you break it down into the individual sectors, there is a degree of specialization that comes in which diplomats may not have. So that's where the supporting them to play that role is important. And I think that's probably, if we are to really achieve something with the recommendation on the implementation of the humanitarian development peace nexus, I think it is maximizing the potential that diplomats can play in fragile and conflict affected contexts by giving them the information that they need when they need it to allow them to play that role. So I think there's really great potential for me in that space, and it's unfortunately, though, the downside of this comes back to the point I think Mihaela was making earlier on, where it comes back to resources. I mean, already we see how stressed many diplomatic organizations are. We've seen diplomatic resources cut by some countries. And maybe there is part of that is reflected in a lack of appreciation of what they do and indeed what the potential of what they do is. But from our perspective, looking at the diversity of issues in fragile conflict context, looking at the importance of working with the local political settlement, with political leadership at different levels within society, looking at building the best possible cohesion across different pillars of the humanitarian development peace nexus, diplomats have a huge advantage across all of those areas, and I think it's something well worth resourcing.
So diplomats obviously, as you mentioned, have this bridging effect, but within the development space and within the let's say, if we want to call it the fragility niche, there are, as we discussed, several different actors, multilaterals, development banks, the OECD. You all take slightly different approaches to the idea of fragility. You alluded to it earlier, the fragility trap, or fragility as risks and lack of coping capacity. How do you make sense of and conceptualize kind of the additive capacity of these different perspectives of fragility, and how should those working in the field, perhaps in development institutions, but also across the nexus, make sense of these different perspectives and kind of use the best of each of them?
I think the first thing to say there is that I don't think it's a bad thing that there is this variety of understandings of the concept. And it's one of the things I've enjoyed about joining this community is that there is a vibrant discussion. We can pick up the phone to the IMF or the World Bank or to a think tank in South Africa, or we can, speak to the Asian Development Bank or whoever the case may be. And the variety of perspectives is a really healthy thing, because I think it challenges us to test our own assumptions, and I think there is a value, a real value to that, and I think it's something to be cherished. Where we perhaps need to consider our approach a bit more is how we communicate that, and I think that is. Are we being clear about what our analysis says, and are we being clear about how it relates to the other types of analysis that are out there, and what's useful to people who are designing policies and programs? So there is a big communications element of this that we are very mindful of, and I think if you look at the OECD's approach to fragility over the last 5 years in particular, what you see is a steady evolution, not just of thinking about the concept and how it works for our membership, but also how we communicate that concept. So the reports are getting smaller. We're trying to diversify the kinds of outputs that we create to make them as usable and as integratable as possible for donors and members. And we're not the only ones doing that. A lot of people are doing that. And if we can alleviate the kind of burden on our membership by doing that, then I think that's a really important contribution. So I think that is the communications part of it is important, and I think we're seeing progress, but there more needs to be done. I think the diversity of conversation within the community is quite healthy. It goes beyond just the policy community. I think that there is a vibrant exchange with the academic community as well, and I think we see people like David Carman and Carlton, and we see also think tanks like ODI, and there is a constant conversation there as well, where assumptions are being tested and ideas are being exchanged. I think what we've maybe missed during COVID is the interaction at national level with some of the kind of the national level bodies. I think we've maintained it quite well, or as well as anybody has with the tools available to us. But we've certainly missed that person-to-person contact and contact and the ability to exchange ideas more freely. And hopefully we're going to see that come back now, because I think a lot of the more detailed questions about, well, how does this affect the way we design our programs, come forward from those kinds of conversations, and they have been limited because you just can't replicate the scale when you're working remotely.
We went towards we talked about the how during COVID the main thing that was lacking was the face-to-face communication kind of meeting, and how that perhaps broke the link between, or not broke, but made it harder to inform programming on.
I don't know if that necessarily answered your question. I think maybe that was the point on communicating during COVID. Maybe it was a bit of a tangent, but I think the positive is the diversity that we've seen in the community, and I think the challenge is to communicate that what we do more effectively. And I think the way I would try and conceptualize that is that we have a capacity to share the burden, and I think we have depending on the organization, we have different competencies that we can bring to bear. So if we can harness that sense of community that we have on one side and bring that forward through to how we deliver for our membership on the other, I think we're going in the right direction.
Actually, I think this should be the last question, because we don't want to take up too much of your time. First of all, we also agree with the need for communication. This is actually the reason why we started the podcast. We felt that it doesn't hurt to bring together people from the different organizations and expose absolutely all of the thinking on fragility. So we're very happy to hear you highlight the importance of communication. As for my last question, I'm really curious about how the States of Fragility approach has evolved. I've just seen the Human Dimension report that you guys just released, and I was very excited to read it. I'm really curious if you can share with us what is new this year, If there's things you have to unveil in the fall, we understand. But at the very least, maybe you can talk about what's new, what is the human dimension, and how does it enhance the framework? How does it add a new dimension to the five already there?
So the current framework, as I mentioned earlier, is in existence since I think it was designed in 2015, launched in 2016. And since 2019, we've been looking at what needs to change. We were mindful of a kind of that 5-year point coming up where it was a good time to reevaluate the framework and get a sense of what works and what doesn't and what needs to be updated. One of the big parts of that conversation initially was the feeling that the framework was not necessarily geared towards telling stories around education and health and social protection as well as it should be. And this is where the idea for the human dimension evolved from. So with the next report in September, we will launch a 6th dimension to the framework, which will be the human dimension, which will pick up on precisely those issues. And that was driven, interestingly, by a lot of, when we talk about the connections that matter between different issues in a fragile context, some of the examples that we looked at were civil service reforms that were disconnected from educational processes and therefore struggle to hit the targets that they had set for themselves. So that's precisely the kind of instance where the value of bringing that analysis into a multidimensional framework is really important. On the health side, I think, again, the experience we're still going through with the pandemic exemplifies the importance of focusing on health and health systems. And likewise with social protection, again, for the same reason. So I think the new dimension addresses those gaps that we had identified going back to 2019. Some of the other changes we're looking at this year, I mentioned already that we've significantly overhauled the environmental dimension. So I think it's much more in step with some of the literature that has emerged over the last 5 years. And I think it's also more in step with some of the thinking, policy and programmatic thinking that we're seeing among our membership. So we're trying to kind of more astutely support them in the direction that they want to take. The other thing we're keen to emphasize, one, is the communication on the resilience part of our understanding of fragility, the coping capacity side, not just the risk side. That is something that we're going to try and address with the next report. The other is the idea of the universality of fragility, and while we've been clear on this, and indeed we were clear on it in the last report, I think 2 years on from the start of the pandemic, we have a much better appreciation now of that the universal presentation of fragility, and therefore and why that matters. So yes, there are some. It is true that some drivers of fragility are localized and maybe particularly important at a national level, but no matter where you live on the planet, what's happening elsewhere on the planet can affect you, and we've seen that. So I think that is there is that level of analysis that I think the framework will be a bit better geared to capture as well. So I think that I think is another step beyond, another step away from the more state-centric approaches that we've seen previously, and that journey we've been on to that striking a better balance of analysis. I also think it's a more honest approach. I think that certainly when we speak to fragile contexts themselves, I think it's easier when you can, it helps us step beyond the idea of a label of fragility more effectively. I think that's probably the best way I could put it, where there is that sense that there is, to come back to your earlier point, Paul, that there is this much broader manifestation and countries are dealing with it continuously as best as they can. And we have seen some countries who, would be classified maybe as middle income developed states who have fallen sharply due to conflict. We've seen other countries who have never experienced conflict but experience fragility. And I think that distinction between fragility and conflict is important. So I think there is a more balanced emphasis than what we're trying to achieve in that regard. So that is, if you like, the thinking behind the report has evolved in that way. Specifically, our focus on the next report will be on how to respond to compound risk, and particularly looking at preventative measures. So we have yet to decide how that is going to break down, but I think it is there is definitely an appetite for more thinking on how to do prevention better. So we're going to look at that. But I think what we've seen over the last 2 years is the importance of responses that can deal with compound risk, and in the most fragile context, that epitomizes the challenge that they experience. And I think hopefully with the new framework, what we can do better is, in that instance, look at, say, the overlay, the correlation between extreme fragility, say, and ecological hotspots, and what that tells us. And I think that's where, again, hopefully you can start to drive more informed conversations about what more integrated responses might look like and more coordinated responses can look like. So hopefully that's where we will go. But we're only just at the beginning of that journey now. We're nearly finished with the updating and review of the framework, and now we're about to transition into the drafting of the report itself.
Well, Jonathan, I think we could talk for hours longer than, I think we've already been talking for about an hour and a half. So we really appreciate you taking the time, and we really thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. And I actually have a final comment on the human dimension. As I was reading the report you guys put out, as you're announcing that this is going to be added, I actually was thinking about the United States. And I was thinking about, wow, this is a wonderful document that should be read here when you're trying to eliminate, let's say, whatever level of a gender pay gap, but you're not addressing the need for childcare or maternal leave, which the United States is one of the only 2 countries in the world that doesn't have that. So when you're looking at, I really appreciate you have taken fragility, you and your team have taken fragility beyond borders, and you're genuinely considering highlighting fragilities that exist in systems for people, and they can be found even in high-income countries. Right here, where I am in Washington, D.C., as I was reading your report, I could think of more than just the example I gave. So this is a very, very exciting update, and we hope to have you back if you would be so kind to join us again. And you and your team, you're doing fantastic work, and we generally appreciate you taking the time to talk to us today.
Thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity, and it would be remiss of me not to mention the team. As I've mentioned at the start, I am new to this space, and I have the benefit of an immensely brilliant multidisciplinary team in the Crises and Fragility team at the OECD, and none of this happens without everybody working together. So hopefully it's a reasonably good reflection of all of us in that regard. So thank you for the opportunity. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you for tuning into F-World, the Fragility Podcast. We hope you found our conversation interesting and inspirational. Please subscribe where you listen to podcasts. And if you want to know more about F-World, please visit our website, f-world.org, and follow us on Twitter at F-World Podcast. Thanks for listening.